When I think of community, I think of a little one-room church about 2 miles from my family farm. It took my father in back in the 1930s during the Depression. It's a small church in the middle of nowhere. It's about a mile from where my father's family lived at that time. My dad was very upfront about why he became a Christian and joined the church. They had a potluck meal on Sundays after each service. In those days, rural people still predominantly used horses to go to church, so people contributed what they could for a meal because it might be a long way back home. My teenaged father figured out that if he attended the service, he could eat, which was something that was not entirely predictable back at his parents' sharecropper shack. So my father became a Christian. Soon the church hired him as a custodian, which meant that he did a little bit of cleaning up and he built fires on the pot-bellied stove on winter Sundays. When my father went to war, they put a photograph, he always said on the front, a photograph of him until he got back from the war. Yeah, right there. And 5 years later, he married my mom in that church. Now, I attended services there sometimes as a kid. I went to revivals there. I remember, for example, a revival preacher who claimed he had grown up as a cannibal. But Jesus had saved him from that fate. He found Jesus, but he did have pointed file teeth, by the way. I don't know why. The little church is between my family farm and the small town where my parents later went to church. And when my father died, I drove my mom by that church to pay respects. And when my mom died, I drove by and paid my respects. A couple of my kids now live on the family farm, and sometimes they get lost and call me on the cell phone because there's no signs on any of the roads out there. And I always ask first, have you seen the church and which side of the car was it on? And anytime I get back, I do go by that church because for me, that's the essence of what religious community can be. It nourishes, it teaches, it celebrates, it mourns, it remembers, and it's an anchor across the generations. That's what religious communities can do well. Now, Martin Luther, in the Protestant Reformation, set in motion what would eventually become a privatized religion in European Protestantism. It's about individuals and your personal religious beliefs. Even Roman Catholicism here in the U.S. has fallen into that, chipper of individualism, shall we say, and hence we nowadays have cafeteria Catholics. Martin Luther's Protestantism has now pretty well erased what the American fundamentalists called, in my youth, Romanism, ritualism, and rationalism. Those were the evils. And so here we are. In the U.S., this individualism has been institutionalized in our Constitution as a wall of separation between church and state. And that wall has held up fairly well despite a lot of inclinations toward theocracy over the years. The conservative side of Christian religious thought is overt in this subjective individualistic turn. Do you have a personal relationship with Jesus as your Lord and Savior? You get asked that a lot in the South, even walking down the sidewalk. The liberal wing, well, from New Age to spiritual but not religious to atheism, is pure individualism at play. The goal for us is to find ourselves and to be true to ourselves. Our souls, or minds, for those of us who don't believe in souls, are completely our own by gosh and by golly. It's individual and personal. Consequently, in the United States today, 70% of Americans label themselves Christian, but only 17% ever go to church. Now, that's not a whole lot of commitment, is it? You've probably read that being religious is good for your health. Now, it isn't the specific religious beliefs that are good for you, but the fact that you do something religiously. You get out of bed, brush your teeth, we hope, and you go somewhere to meet people and to cooperate with people, we hope, and to share and to learn. For one thing, religious communities help us cope with things. That's why it's healthy. As I've said before, if you got a scary medical diagnosis, I can virtually guarantee you that there are several people in the room today who have also had that and survived. And if you meet any kind of life challenge, someone in this room has also seen it, done it, and survived. When I say in my words of welcome each week that this congregation is the birthplace of Congregational Humanism, what I'm talking about is the insight that people in this congregation had that religious community, doing something religiously, doesn't have to mean strict creeds or specific beliefs. What we do here is, as a matter of fact, countercultural. We've tried to live up to that quote that Frederick Douglass has in your order of service this morning. Quote, "I bow to no priests, either of faith or of unfaith. I claim, as against all sorts of people, simply perfect freedom of thought." Perfect freedom of thought. At its founding, back in 1881, the people of First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis stated their purpose, which they said was this, quote, "To form an association where people, without regard to theological differences, may unite for mutual helpfulness in intellectual, moral, and religious culture and humane work." That's 1881. And yeah, that's interesting, without regard to theological differences. I think that's the key reason that the people of this congregation have remained Unitarian over the years, even though the ministers have tended to be humanist. We want to underline the fact that we have beliefs and no beliefs. We have both faith and unfaith. Before its official founding, FUS had functioned as a Darwin reading group. And this is the month of Darwin, yay, we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. And before that, as a group fighting the crackdown on pornography in the U.S. mail, pornography being, of course, birth control information and information about socialism and atheism. They lost that battle. Since 1881, First Unitarian Society has been a gathering of agnostics, apatheists, atheists, infidels, Darwinists, Marxists, anarchists, and freethinkers in general, and Christians, and Taoists, and Buddhists, and Hindus, and what have yous. But back to that quote from Frederick Douglass in the Order of Service, "I bow to no priests, either of faith or of unfaith. I claim, as against all sorts of people, simply perfect freedom of thought." Sikivu Hutchinson, who some of you have heard speaking here, in her book Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Value Wars, highlights that this comment by Douglass was pointed at black preachers who demanded that Douglass publicly thank God for emancipation. Douglass, who had escaped from slavery on his own 2 feet, thank you very much, right? And had worked with Lincoln on the Emancipation Proclamation, knew that freedom was no miracle. It required hard work and wading in some water. Douglass did not react well to getting out of real slavery and going back and having people to tell him what to do and what to think. FUS has been a grand experiment in that tradition that Douglass sets out. The rules of the road here are simple, but darn difficult to live up to. We do not attempt to convince others of our own beliefs or narratives or worldviews or opinions. We share them, and we ought to share them, but we do not expect people to mirror back our opinions. And that is a very grand and difficult experiment. It's the purpose of the place all the way back to the beginning. And frankly, very few organizations have ever been able to sustain that project over time. FUS is an outlier and a survivor in that. If you like history, you should come sometime during the week and spend a few hours in our archives, what we call the Heritage Room, down the hall and to the left. There's a lot of insights to be had in those old musty boxes. One old order of service includes these words, quote, "In this place there is a fearless quest of the truth that makes people free," end quote. John Dietrich's pledge to the congregation when he first preached back in 1916. He said, "I shall try to stimulate and guide you in your thinking that you may work out your own conceptions of religion and mortality," end quote. And Ray Bragg, who was the minister after Dietrich, and actually the guy who drafted the first Humanist Manifesto, he said this here: "We do not believe what we want to believe. We believe what we must. Belief is a guide to action, not the answer to a riddle. We are called upon not to believe nor disbelieve, but to understand. Understanding requires discipline," he said. "With such effort, life can be richer, our minds will be clearer, and our sympathies broadened," end quote. Now, for most of the world's people, in this nation and elsewhere, they don't get that choice. They don't get to think until they can understand what their religious tradition is telling them. We are special and darn lucky. Attending here means existing in a multi-faith, multicultural, multi-philosophical context. And in such a context, each of us finds the others in some ways inspiring and in some ways, what? You think what? But try to say that nicely and continue the conversation. But here's the thing. Not being forthright and clear about your deepest thinking and your deepest commitments is not only a way of lying, but also a denial of potential insights to everybody else. Think about it that way. You owe it to us to talk about what you think. Share the understanding and share your struggle with figuring it all out, because none of us will ever figure it all out. Personal belief is personal. What matters, though, is a commitment to act in certain ways. Because humanism, as I say over and over and over again, is not a belief system. It's a way of being and acting in the world. Now, we know that people gather into groups for companionship, for a positive experience. We hope it's positive, and to experience an ennobling sense of purpose. That's why you go to any kind of club, group, etc. Our challenge as an institution, and your challenge as the people who make the institution in this generation, is to be part of a collective project to make it safe to share dangerous ideas, to make it a place here where people listen to each other. And yet, listening is a countercultural activity. We want to make this place a place that insists upon the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That is the value that FUS can add to your life. To contradict the Dave Clark 5, the name of this place is not "I Like It Like That." Just remind yourself, early and often, the name of this place is not "I Like It Like That." That's why we stand up every week and repeat that short, but I hope punchy and meaningful congregational covenant. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We want to nurture a dynamic, intergenerational community that offers opportunities for celebration, creative renewal, relationships, and that mutual support that they talked about back in 1881. We want to do all the things that make congregations magical and special places. But we seek to do it without imposing either faith or unfaith. We seek to achieve Douglas's perfect freedom of thought. That's the hard part. No, we don't always live up to our goals and our commitments. That's why we formed a right relations team that Jim's planning to talk about next Sunday. Well, yeah, unless the muses speak otherwise. But they will have a meeting next Sunday to talk about it. Now, having lived a long time, I now realize that here's the thing about living a life. There needs to be a dream that can remain a dream, if that makes sense. You need to have a dream that can remain a dream. Someone this week was saying, yeah, Martin Luther King did not say, I have a goal today. No. A dream's a little farther out there to keep going for. Getting rich isn't an adequate dream because nobody ever gets rich enough. Right? Getting famous is not an adequate dream because nobody ever gets famous enough. Fancy new car will never answer your dream because no car stays new and it never feels all that fancy after you've driven around the block a few times. A dream that can remain a dream is what we have to have. And here's the thing. There's plenty of facts and figures and information out there. You got that phone in your pocket, most of us. You can find it all by yourself. Facts, figures, knowledge, history. It flows over us like a downpour. In addition, most of us in this room are lucky enough to have several options. But how do you find a dream? Not just explore options. That direction that feels like a worthy thing to be doing with your life. That's the search, ultimately. And after we find a sustaining dream and direction, we need to keep going. And often that's what congregations can do, is keep you going when you religiously go Sunday to Sunday and brush your teeth. Congregations of people can aid you in the journey because, at least here, we insist that meaning is human-generated, meaning and purpose. If you look it up in a textbook, what you're going to quickly discover is that what we are attempting in this congregation cannot be done. You can't have a group of people who don't agree on some very basic things about how reality works. It's not possible to have Douglas's simply perfect freedom of thought in a group. You've got to have, as Douglas called it, a priest of faith or a priest of unfaith to tell you what to do. Yet, here we are. And I'm not a priest of faith or of unfaith. I hope I'm just here to help consider the options, because I don't have the answers, in case you're wondering. Some of you perceive reality through numbers. I don't get it, frankly. Some of you perceive reality through scientific method, which also I don't get. Some of you understand through art and aesthetics, which is how I've spent my life. But here we are together because we believe that personal, subjective beliefs can be put aside for a greater good, which is to sustain each other in our dreams and to help make the world a better place. As I've often said, the core value of humanism is that people matter more than ideas. This is not what most people think. Hence, wars and terrorism. But it is a core humanist value. What we think we believe is so contingent. It's so balanced on a knife's edge. Where you're from, where your family is from, who your family is, gender assignments, arbitrary labels. Meaning depends so much on those things. And it's so darn arbitrary. Humanism says that those are arbitrary. If anything is sacred, then life itself is the most sacred thing. Now, we must hold to that truth because the universe, at least the way I see it, does not exist to hold life sacred. I'm an old farmer, and I just don't see it that way. Far from it. I mean, ask all the rabbits and the squirrels and the deer and the foxes and some people who froze to death last week how much nature holds them and cares about them. It is our empathy, our compassion, our caring that is all the kindness that there is on the planet. That's pretty special, and it's a good thing to be doing. That's what has kept this place together since 1881. A community that nourishes, teaches, celebrates, mourns, remembers, and is an anchor across the generations.